Young people should live their lives as normally as they can. They should always wash their hands, and we have to do a better job protecting the elderly, the old people, the high risk. Stay home if you're sick, and those things, sort of general precautions. We know that obesity and diabetes increases risk, so if you ever want to live a more healthy life with exercising and eating healthy, this is a good time to do that. And there's no negative consequences of that. Kids should be out in the playground, so playing soccer or cricket or rugby. Those are important things, and we shouldn't prevent people from doing those things.
What is the efficacy? Who can have it? How do we roll it out? Do we need to test it?
We don't know yet about the COVID-19 vaccines. If the Pfizer vaccine is a miracle vaccine, wonderful, great. But there are still question marks about that, of course.
Something's not right. To see the government, the mainstream media, and our technology platforms suppress science, I mean, it's hard to watch.
The consequence of the lockdown is something we're going to have to live with and die with for many years in the future, unfortunately. What eventually will change it is coming from below, from the population. When there are protests against lockdowns throughout Europe, I have more trust in the population to change this compared to the politicians.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go? This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Dr. Martin Kulldorff, the epidemiologist, statistician, and professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. You are an expert in infectious disease and have dedicated your working life to detecting and monitoring disease outbreaks, while also conducting vaccine safety evaluations for the CDC. Last month, you published the Great Barrington Declaration to outline your serious concerns with global lockdown measures that are causing excessive collateral damage to our economy, our mental health, and our younger generation's futures. You advocated focused protection, which means those at minimal risk can live normal lives while those vulnerable are shielded, with the long-term aim to develop herd immunity throughout the global population. Dr. Kulldorff, welcome to London Real.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure.
Great having you here. Before we get started, I just want to announce that we are streaming now on our Digital Freedom platform, which is a censorship-free, independent broadcasting system that is of the people, by the people, for the people, and available exclusively on our website at freedomplatform.tv. Can everyone watching us now please share this link via the sidebar to any and all of your social media channels? Let me repeat that. Can everyone watching please share this link now via the sidebar to all of your social media channels? This is important. Simply ask your friends and family to give us 15 minutes, and then they can make their own decision. Dr. Kulldorff, I pledge to you and everyone watching us that none of this conversation will be edited, censored, removed, or banned, and that anyone in the world can watch the full version of this episode free at freedomplatform.tv/Kulldorff, thanks to the generous donations of over 39,000 people around the world that we affectionately call the London Real Army. For anybody wanting to become a founding member of the Digital Freedom Platform, they can visit freedomplatform.tv/give to donate and fight with us on the front lines to protect our human rights. As your next mayor of London, I promise to fight for the legislation of digital freedom of speech for all. Here at London Real, we've been a platform for free speech since 2011. And Dr. Kulldorff, I'm super excited to have you here today. You know, I looked back through the records, and since April, you have been openly talking about this, the fact that there is a 1,000-fold difference in COVID-19 mortality between the old and the young. Basically, you're saying that COVID danger is age-specific. Last month in October, you and two other leading scientists, Dr. Sunetra Gupta and Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, published the Great Barrington Declaration. We've heard a lot about it. For people that don't know, Doctor, can you tell us what is the Great Barrington Declaration? What's the summation of what you published?
So if we look at the response to COVID-19 worldwide, what we did in the spring was to throw out basic principles of public health. And there are three basic principles. One is when you look at public health, you look at it long-term, not short-term. So minimizing death in the short term might not be the best if that means you have more death in the long term. The second one is that you can't look only at one disease, COVID-19. You have to look at health overall. And the lockdowns have had severe collateral damage on other aspects of the public health. Everything from plummeting childhood immunization rates, worse cardiovascular disease outcomes. There are fewer cancers that are detected, but that's not because we have fewer cancers, it's because we're not detecting it and then we're not giving these people the proper treatment. You mentioned mental health, which has deteriorated. We have, in many developing countries, we have people who are starving to death, hunger, children who are doing that. So there are enormous collateral damage to the lockdowns, and that's because we are focusing singularly on one disease, COVID-19, instead of looking at the whole picture. So what we're saying in the Great Barrington Declaration, which now has over 600,000 signatures, is that while everybody can be infected, young or old, the mortality risk and the risk for severe disease is very, very age dependent, with a more than 1,000-fold difference between the oldest and the youngest. So for the old people, this is worse than the annual influenza. For children, the annual influenza is more dangerous than COVID-19. So COVID-19 is not a serious disease for young people. So what we're saying is that for older people, we have to do a better job protecting them and helping them protect themselves, which we have failed during this last half year with the lockdown strategy that has been in place in most countries.
I think you were...
Time for young people, the damage is much bigger from all the collateral damage than the minuscule risk that they have from COVID-19. So they need to go back to near normal lives.
I think you were quoted as saying, as a public health scientist, you were absolutely stunned by the reaction of governments for the past 6 or 7 months. I mean, tell me how that feels emotionally when you see this whole thing play out, when so many of these actions are not, it's not based on science, is it? It's actually not based on the numbers. It's based on what it seems to be an emotional reaction.
Yeah, so I have worked with infectious disease outbreaks for a couple of decades, collaborating with and interacting with many local and state and national health departments on disease outbreaks. And when then you hear in the media that there is follow the science for something that I don't think is at all according to science, that's very surprising and stunning. And it was also very difficult in March, April to get the word out there from those of us who had a different view than what was pursued by the media. I was able to publish in my native Sweden, but in the US, I was not able to publish back in March and April. And it's a little strange because those scientists that I have personal relationship with, who works in infectious disease epidemiology, the majority are in favor of focused protection. But somehow it became the herd thinking of doing lockdowns and those things. And I'm still surprised. And if you go back to previous years, every country in Europe had, or at least the major countries in Europe had prepared a pandemic response plans. And when 2020 came, they were all thrown out the window except for Sweden. So what we are proposing in the Great Barrington Declaration is nothing novel, or it's not rocket science. It's basic public health principles that are in accordance with the various pandemic preparation plans that different countries have prepared.
Right. And someone like you has spent a portion of your career kind of game planning these future scenarios. And like you said, countries in Europe had game plans. And yet, for some reason, when COVID hit, that all went out the window. And politicians seem to make decisions and handpick or cherry pick the scientists that seem to support these decisions. Is that what happened?
Yeah, and I think both, not only the politicians, I think also the media was cherry picking scientists. And then other scientists outside of the field, they thought that this was the consensus, even though it was against, contrary to what many of us infectious disease epidemiologists were thinking.
Okay. And look, I want to talk separately about the censorship that you've received before and after the declaration, the treatment by the mainstream media, et cetera. But just to get into the intellectual property of the declaration itself, and again, just to kind of restate some of the things that you said, is that there is this massive collateral damage of the lockdown that's just not being quantified, I think, by people and governments. And that means economic damage, mental health damage, physical health damage, substance abuse increases, I think smoking and drinking, suicide, domestic abuse, strain on the education system, poverty, even hunger. All of these are taking massive hits to the lockdown, and yet no one's really talking about them or quantifying them. Is that right?
I think that's right. And we are not quantifying what's occurring now very well. But at the same time, many of these consequences of public health we won't see this year. So COVID-19 is sort of immediate because people are getting sick this year and they're dying this year. But if we look at cancer, for example, if the cancer is not detected this year, they're not going to die this year. But maybe they'll die if they don't have a pap smear. They will die of cervical cancer maybe 3 years from now instead of living another 15 years. So those mortality statistics, we don't have them yet, but that doesn't mean they're not real. So this is something, the consequence of the lockdown is something we're going to have to live with and die with for many years in the future, unfortunately.
Right. And again, this idea of focused protection says, let's take the vulnerable. And again, correct me if I'm wrong, but is this over 70 with other ailments and kind of protect them, and everybody under a certain age range, should basically get back to their lives and go back to work? Or what are some of the specifics around that focused protection?
So the biggest risk factor is age. There are also obesity, diabetes, for example. That's also risk factors, but age is the primary risk factor. And there are different situations depending on the living arrangement of older people. So those who are at most vulnerable are those living in nursing homes and other similar care settings. And we have utterly failed to protect them through this lockdown measure. It has not worked. So people think that just by locking down everybody, we will protect them, but that's not going to happen. So we have to have very specific protection towards them. And things that we need to do is if the staff, because it's often the staff who brings in the infection to the nursing homes. So if they've already had COVID-19 and they're immune, that's the best, because then they won't infect the staff. If they haven't had it, so they're not immune, then we need to do very frequent testing of them. And now when we're in the second wave, that testing should be daily or every other day. Very, very frequent testing. Also, nursing home residents need to have visits from their family and friends. That's very important for the general health. But it's also important that we test the visitors. And if they're positive, well, they're going to have to delay the visit by 3 or 4 weeks, while some other family member would have to sort of step in and visit instead. Also, we have to minimize staff rotation so that the same particular residents minimize the number of staff they interact with. Also, we should not, different nursing homes shouldn't share staff between them. And of course, if somebody gets infected, they should immediately be moved to a place where they cannot put other nursing home residents at risk. So those are things that we can do. Among the things that we can do in nursing homes, of course, it's also important with washing hands and masks and those things in nursing homes. A second group are older people who live at home, maybe with a spouse or some other older relative. And there we have to help them so that they can be delivered food from the supermarket, so they do not have to go out to the supermarket. They should be very careful and not be out in a crowded setting, especially not indoor settings. They should also be outdoors, outside, because exercise is important and fresh air is important. And when they meet with relatives, it's better to do it outside than indoors. But if they do meet indoors, again, testing would be important, not of the elderly, but of the visitors. A third group are people who are still, they're over 60, so they're still somewhat high risk, but they are still in the working, out there working. So if they can work from home, they should. But if, and for example, teachers, schools should be open for in-person teaching for children, but if teachers are above 60, then maybe they can work at home, either doing online teaching or helping other teachers grading exams or homework and stuff like that. Other people who are over 60 and they cannot work from home, maybe they're a janitor or a cab driver, we should help them so that they can take a 3 to 4 month sabbatical, maybe using some early retirement funds for temporary retirement or temporary sabbatical during this time now when we have the peak of the second wave. A fourth group, which is the most difficult one, are people who live in multi-generational homes. We know from studies from Sweden that they are not at risk from grandchildren who are children who go to schools, but they are at higher risk if they live with some working age adults. So if those younger adults, if they can work from home, that's also good to protect not themselves, but to protect their older relatives. If that's not possible for them to work at home, then maybe they can live with a sibling or an older friends during a temporary 3 or 4 month period during the height of the peak. Or if that's not possible, we could offer them empty hotel rooms because they're not full at this time. So there are various creative ways that we can do a better job protecting the elderly. And in the pandemic, we can't do it 100%. That's impossible. But what we're doing now is we are protecting younger college students who are very low risk and young professionals who can work from homes, like lawyers or journalists or scientists like me. Those are the ones we are protected, even though we are very low risk, while in the working class, they are out there driving the cab, working as a janitor, working in the supermarket because they have no choice. So it's the older working class, high risk, who are building up the immunity in the population that will eventually protect all of us, while we are protecting low risk college students and low risk professionals. So it's sort of backwards. And if you look at the data, we can actually see that we have been successful in protecting the professionals, because working class, and especially the inner city working class, have been affected much, much more with much higher mortality. So just like we are able to protect the professional class, which we have done through these lockdowns through the last half year, it is possible also to do a much better job protecting the elderly, the high-risk elderly. Not 100%, that's impossible in a pandemic, but we can do a much, much better job than we have done if we just try and put our minds to it.
Right. No, that's a really good explanation. And you said before, quote, the working class are taking on the burden of generating herd immunity, and they're the ones actually at most risk, especially when there are those older groups. You also went on to say that, those who are not vulnerable should be immediately allowed to resume to life as normal. You said simple hygiene measures like hand washing and staying home when you're sick should be practiced by everybody to reduce the herd immunity threshold. I think you said young, low-risk adults should work normally rather than from home. Restaurants and other businesses should open, while arts, music, sports, and other cultural activities should resume, and schools and universities should be open for in-person teaching. And yet, doctor, we're not seeing any of that because, like you said, we are protecting most of those people that don't need protection.
Yeah, it's backwards.
It must be frustrating for you as a scientist to look at the numbers that are actually proving your theory, and yet the media and the governments present this one number every day, you know, total cases, and we're going to get into this, and total deaths, but we don't look into who are those deaths, what are the circumstances, what's happening. And when we see that number, we think it's our kids, our brothers, our sisters, when it's actually a different part of the population. Is that right?
Yeah, and to look at the cases are not very informative because that depends so much on testing. So if we increase testing, the cases are going to increase. If we decrease testing, it's going to decrease. So hospitalization is, of course, an important metric, and mortality is an important metric. But the ultimate metric is actually all-cause mortality and comparing it to previous years. And I don't know the statistics for the UK, but if we look at the United States, the last time I checked, there was over 230,000 COVID deaths in the United States, which is hugely tragic. And a lot of those are the consequence of the misguided lockdown strategies and not protecting the elderly properly. But if we compare the mortality in the US compared to previous years, there is, in addition to that, another almost 100,000 additional excess deaths. So for cardiovascular disease, for example, and we don't know exactly how they divide between cardiovascular versus mental issues versus diabetes, for example. But we know what the total is, and we can compare that to Sweden, which was being closest to a more traditional public health strategy. They haven't done a perfect job, and especially in Stockholm, they failed to protect the nursing home residents during the spring. But Sweden has 6,000, a little over 6,000 COVID deaths now.
And what did Sweden do? For people that don't know, what did they do or did not do specifically?
So far, Sweden has about 6,000 excess COVID deaths, but the number of excess deaths compared to the previous 5 years is just below 2,000.
Okay.
So US has sort of a more excess deaths than COVID deaths, but Sweden have less excess deaths than COVID deaths. So that is a hugely important statistic.
Okay. Yeah.
Evaluate different approaches. So what Sweden did, it tried to protect the elderly. It didn't succeed completely, and especially not in Stockholm in the beginning. But it also kept, as the only major Western country, it kept schools open throughout the height of the pandemic. And education is critically important for children, not only for the education, but also for physical health, mental health, and social development, interacting with friends. So if we look at Sweden, schools and daycare were open from age 1 to age 15 throughout the height of the pandemic. And there are 1.8 million children in Sweden for this age group. And during this time, the number of children among these 1.8 million who died of COVID was exactly 0. And there were only a handful of hospitalizations. So this is not a serious disease for children and is much less risky than the annual flu, which in the United States will kill typically between 200 and 1,000 children every year, depending on how severity of the influenza season. Also, if we looked at Sweden, the teachers were not at higher risk than the average of other professions. So and we know from, for example, in a genetic study in Iceland that while adults can't transmit the disease, infect children, it's less common for children to infect adults. So there's absolutely no public health reason to not have the children in school, in person, full time, while there are many public health reasons of the damage that's caused by not having them in school.
Right.
So that's one example. And Sweden didn't close restaurants. They had precautions of more spacing between the visitors and so on, but they didn't close restaurants, etc.
Right. And so just to reiterate, you were saying before that the total lockdown doesn't make sense because it tries to protect everyone. And also in some cases, by locking down the elderly care homes, you're actually doing more damage because what you really want to be doing is testing there more and evaluating there. Opening everything up as well isn't the best scenario because, like you said, I think you're not protecting the elderly. Certain people need more protection. There's some hybrid model that makes sense based on those numbers and each one of those age groups. That's the optimal way forward that could prevent a significant loss of life, prevent the economy from going down, prevent all this collateral damage. And that's the model you're proposing in the Great Barrington Declaration. Is that about right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. And then we've seen Sweden do probably the closest thing to that. And you're saying with the adjusted deaths, I'm curious what you think, but is that a success? We've also seen a place like Australia lock everything down and try to extinguish any case. I'm curious what you think about that, because I know in the future, we think that sooner or later, they're going to have to deal with this virus. And I'm also curious what you think of China, because it seems as if they've done something similar, which is completely extinguish the virus for 1 billion people. Again, that doesn't seem like that's going to be practical going forward. Can you give me your thoughts on some of those things? Maybe start with Sweden and then go into some of these other countries?
Yeah, so I think Sweden has less of the collateral damage because, and we know from some of the statistics for that also, for example, in the US, childhood immunization rates plummeted in the spring. And but in Sweden, there was no negative effect of childhood immunizations. So that's just one tiny example of something that you can actually sort of monitor in real time. I think in Australia, they have a severe collateral damage from their lockdowns. So I don't think that those lockdowns are good for that reasons. I haven't seen the statistics for it, but they will obviously be available as time goes. Asia is a very interesting case, and I don't think I understand it fully, but an interesting case is Japan, who did not lock down, and they haven't had much mortality. But there was a recent study showing that antibodies were actually quite high. So it seems like the COVID-19 has been circulating quite widely in Japan without resulting in a lot of mortality. So there must be something with Japan that makes it different from North America and Europe. And I'm not sure exactly what it is that makes the infection fatality rate in Japan lower than in many other countries.
Okay. What about China?
Yeah, so I don't know if China it could potentially be similar to Japan and maybe Korea and Taiwan also, but there are many question marks there. But there's something in Asia that makes this disease different from North America and Europe.
Okay. Now, maybe is now a good time to talk about this concept of herd immunity, which, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's this thought process that over a long period of time, every virus it's not able to be contained, and that it's sooner or later, a certain proportion of the population will get it, form immunity, and then, it will be kind of processed by the species. Is that, first of all, am I explaining that right? And second of all, does that mean that Australia will still have to do this sometime in the future? I mean, right now they've locked the borders down, they've extinguished everything, but are they just postponing the inevitable? And maybe is the same question true for China?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of misunderstanding about herd immunity. So first of all, herd immunity is not a strategy. There are no herd immunity strategies. Herd immunity is a well-established scientific fact. And just like gravity in physics. So to deny herd immunity is like denying efficacy of vaccine or thinking that the earth is flat and so on. So that's one surprising thing with this conversation about herd immunity. So what herd immunity says is that once a certain proportion of the population are immune, then the pandemic is going to die down and we will not have these mass infections anymore. It'll still be with us endemic, like the other coronaviruses are. So it will never be eradicated, but there will be very little effect on a continuous basis. So that means that not this pandemic will end before everybody gets infected. So the question then is, if we do nothing, we're going to have some older people and some younger people getting infected, and the older people have higher risk, so we're going to have a fair amount of death. If we do protect everybody equally, then then we are pushing things into the future, but some young people are getting infected and some old people are getting infected, and again, we will have a fair amount of death. But if we do the focused protection strategy, that means that we're minimizing the number of older people that get infected, and we're maximizing the number of older people that are in the group that are not infected, and that's going to minimize the mortality. Now, with there are three ways to reach herd immunity. One is through natural infection, which is the sort of the historically common way that it has been reached. The second is through a vaccine, which is why we have herd immunity from measles now, for example, because if a certain proportion of the population is vaccinated, then those who are not are still protected by those who were vaccinated because they can't circulate so easily. And the third one is the combination of those two. So at some point, we will hopefully have a vaccine. We don't know when, and we don't know how good it will be. We don't know if it will work for everybody or only a certain groups. But hopefully we'll have it very soon. And then, of course, it will take several months for everybody to be administering the vaccine. So that will sort of fit in very perfectly with the focused protection strategy, because the key thing will then to use the vaccine as one more tool, one additional tool to protect the high-risk elderly by, for example, prioritizing vaccinating nursing home staff so that they do not spread it to the elderly, as well, of course, to vaccinate all people themselves if the vaccine has good efficacy for older people.
Right. And I definitely want to talk about vaccines for sure and get your thoughts on that. And I want to talk about the numbers and the statistics that we get thrown every day. You know, before we get into that, let's talk about the censorship of the Great Barrington Declaration or the treatment in the media, because if people try to Google that, and there's been articles written about this, they get, you know, they get a few pieces that vilify it. It's hard to actually find the declaration. It's hard to get facts about it. Maybe you can talk about what the experience has been like for you, first of all, to be unable to publish back in April in the journals in America. And then once you create the declaration, why can't I find it on Google search? Why do I have a hard time finding it on YouTube? Why did the mainstream media come out and call you, quote unquote, anti-lockdown or something deniers, using language that, you know, that dregs up, you know, Holocaust deniers? Tell me, I mean, you're part of this declaration. What was it like to experience this? And am I saying things accurately?
Well, I'm just a simple scientist, so I'm not used to the media. So it was a very surreal experience for me and my colleagues. If we look at the Google example, when I first Googled it just after it came up on the top, but then suddenly it wasn't on the top anymore. So it's something called shadow banning, which Google did, and then instead more recent pieces about the declaration that were very critical of it had kind of rose to the top. And then there were some complaints about, including one senator in the US. So eventually Google sort of reversed themselves, and it's now, I think, at least in the US, is the top if you search for Great Barrington Declaration. Compared to Bing, for example, there was never a problem with that search engine for the declaration. What's also happened is that I think people have a hard time actually coming up with good scientific arguments against the Great Barrington Declaration. So instead, they're using various smears.
Like what?
And both in the US and the UK media. But But
what did they say? What were they trying with the smears?
Well, you mentioned one of them, and there were things about mass murder and all those kind of things like that. And I try mostly to ignore it.
Yeah, what they do is
the declaration speaks for itself, and I hope that people actually read the declaration as well as the FAQ that comes with it to explain things a little bit more in detail.
Yeah, unfortunately, Doctor, it doesn't speak for itself because people get their information from social media and from, we call them search engines, but let's be honest, they are agenda engines. And so you might, well, I know you've written an incredibly comprehensive paper, backed by data that has a great FAQ section, but the problem is very few people will ever get to that. They'll see anti-lockdown, they'll see two people that signed your paper with funny names, and then they discredit the people that signed, or, and then they discredit maybe the people that created it, and then they kind of pass it on. I mean, that is what happened to a certain extent, right?
That is what happened. And another example that you alluded to was there was one journalist who was bragging about adding fake names to the signatories of the declaration. And then you have other journalists who come in and say, oh, there are a lot of fake names as signatories. So to me, that seems a very strange way of journalism to operate, why they would do those kind of in tandem. I mean, some of the names were kind of funny, like Johnny Bananas and similar like that. And so there was some of comic to it, but I don't understand why journalists operate in that way. It seems to be very, very, very illogical or very strange. So,
yeah, welcome to the new era of journalism, where journalists taint the things that they're reporting about and then report about it. It's yeah, and we've seen this is the strange year when it's come to media. I mean, Doctor, I've been doing this for 9 years, having conversations just like this, unedited, unscripted, uncensored. And it wasn't until April of this year, on April 6th, where we had the second largest YouTube live stream in the world by one of my conversations. And that was subsequently banned and deleted on YouTube, and I've been censored ever since. So again, this is new to me. I thought it happened to all the weirdos and the crazy people until it happens to you. And again, the Great Barrington Declaration is written by, high-level professors from Stanford, Oxford, and Harvard, and yet still the press really went after you, and the mainstream media, they tried to really bury the story, which must be a strange experience.
Yeah. So at the same time, I think the declaration was in the success in the sense that I had tried for a long time, and many of my colleagues had tried for a long time to get out this message about public health and that we needed to do a different approach, and not just the three of us, many others. And we were often silenced or simply dismissed for whatever reason. So I think what makes the declaration different wasn't that we were saying anything new. What makes it different was that there were three of us, so it's harder to dismiss three people than one person. We all work with infectious disease epidemiology, so they couldn't dismiss us as not being knowledgeable about the field. And we are all from three reasonably respectable universities, Oxford, Harvard, and Stanford. So they couldn't sort of dismiss us for that reason either. So they came in a situation where we couldn't be dismissed, and therefore we were attacked instead, I think.
Yeah.
Better to be attacked than to be dismissed and silenced, I think.
Yeah, it is. Better to be attacked than ignored. So at least we're having the conversation, which is a plus. But again, you've experienced what it's like to be censored in the media. And again, we could not have this conversation right now on YouTube, or my entire channel would be deplatformed. And that's a 9-year history on that platform, 9,000 videos, 500 million views. But if we were talking about anything like this, it would be censored. And they would come up for a reason. They would say, I violated community policy. I disagreed with something the WHO had said. And then they just pull the video and then pull the channel. And that's YouTube, one technology platform. It happens on so many other tech platforms, like you said, shadow banning. And then not even to mention just the media itself seems to have its own agenda. Which is just something everyone should know. That's all. And a lot of people are opting into new search engines and new social medias, but still. It's hard when they're monopolies.
The example is there was, I think a week or two ago, there was an article in Daily Mail in the UK about how Dr. Gupta had been sort of attacked in various very strange and very unscientific manners. And it's sort of, as a scientist in the US, it's sort of stunning that the United Kingdom, who has, in my view, Sunita Gupta is the preeminent infectious disease technology in the whole world. So why doesn't the UK government actually, they have the best person in your country. So why isn't the government actually listening to her? Because she's extremely knowledgeable. She views it not only as COVID, but as public health in general for outcomes. So to me, that's just very surprising. And instead, instead the media is looking at other people who are much less qualified. So I don't know why doesn't the media and the government in the UK listen more closely to Dr. Gupta?
Well, let's talk about that, because the governments don't seem to be paying attention to the science community, and they don't even seem to be paying attention to their own data oftentimes. I mean, we're in a tier 4 lockdown here in the UK. They've shut the entire economy down. And this is our hospitality sector, our gyms, our libraries, our theaters, our arts, everything has been shut down. Based on a Cambridge study that was proved flawed before the lockdown started. It was proven the data was wrong. It was mispredicting things in real time, doctor. It was over predicting deaths in the days before the lockdown happened. And yet we continually see governments seem to kind of cherry pick the scientists they want and the data they want to serve their agenda. I don't know, what is that like for you to see happen?
Yeah. I mean, so as a scientist, I don't really understand the politics. I don't understand what the agenda is or why they would do this. Obviously, a politician, you can't expect them to understand infectious disease epidemiology. You would and be experts in that. But I think you have to expect that they understand the basic principles of public health, that you cannot only look at one disease, you have to look at all diseases. You have to look long-term and not just short-term. And the important principle of public health is you have to look at the whole population and not just protect the professional class. You have to be equally concerned about protecting the working class and the poor. Those are the three basic principles of public health, and every politician need to understand those three things.
Yeah, and they're all being violated right now.
And whoever advisor they have also have to understand those three basic things.
Yeah, and instead they seem to be concerned about one or two numbers that they've convinced the public are the barometers for how well they're handling the disease. And let's talk about the numbers shortly. They also seem to be concerned for their next election, when they should be thinking about 10 years or 20 years out of the best interests of the economy, the mental health, the physical health, the younger generation. I mean, that's what we would always hope governments do. Scientists are very good at that, and yet it's being ignored. Let's talk about numbers, because you've spoken about cases as a metric and testing. And I want to talk about this. I put out a video a couple weeks ago talking about the numbers that we get thrown every day in the UK media. We get positive test cases, we get hospitalizations, and we get total deaths. And those are the three numbers that are on the Guardian newspaper front page every day. And I want to get your thoughts on them. First of all, you've said before that it doesn't make any sense to look at cases from a scientist. You've said don't test anyone under 18. You've also said more tests equals more cases. Maybe you could talk more about this idea. Also, a positive test, all it means is that it tested positive for the COVID-19 test with whatever threshold happened to be doing. And I'm not going to get into the test itself, which I don't think was designed for COVID. But tell me your thoughts on how we can understand these numbers better, doctor.
Yeah, so if you test a lot of asymptomatic people, like school children or university students, for example, you are going to find positive cases, even though they're not sick. But you're also going to find a lot of false positives. So if you then, as they do in the US, they use that to close schools or send the students home, that's very damaging to these children and these students. So that's sort of a nonsensical from a public health perspective to do all those testing of asymptomatic people.
You mentioned false positive really quick. Can you just explain to people what is a false positive test? And what do we think the percentage is on it's the PCR test, I think, for false positives?
False positives is that the test, and this is not just the COVID, this is for almost any medical test. You will have some who test positive even though they're not truly are positive. You can also have false negative where somebody tests negative even though they have the disease. So that is common, but even if that's very low, suppose it's only 1%. Well, if you test a lot of people, that still adds up. And if you're in a hospital setting where you treating patients, then having a few false positive is not a big issue in a treatment setting. On the other hand, in a surveillance setting where you mass test asymptomatic people, then even a small percentage can create a lot of damage because you're misdiagnosing a lot of people as positive even when they're not.
Right. And I've heard also the false positive could be as high as 20% or 40%, and it could be even higher.
Yes, I don't want to give a specific numbers, and I think it can depend on the exact tests that are being used, because there are different tests for COVID-19, and they probably have different false positive rates. It also depends on which is the population that you are testing. If you're testing people who are symptomatic versus asymptomatic, you're going to have a different false positive rate.
Right.
But by nature of things.
Okay, so you said in general, it doesn't make sense to look at cases, even though this is the number that's like bandied about every single day on every single major publication, the New York Times or whatever, 1 million new cases in America, 100 million globally. I mean, it's every day that number. And that I think you've said that there are 3 numbers to look at, which is hospitalizations, the mortality, and as you were talking about earlier, the excess mortality. Is that true? Should we just ignore looking at cases? Is that number not relevant?
I think in the media, we should ignore it.
Yeah.
The fact that public health officials looks at it, that makes sense, because then you look also at the number of testing and those things. So public health officials should still look at it, but I don't see the point in the media and media presenting it, because it's really the mortality and hospitalizations and excess mortality that are critical.
Right. And yet most major global policy is probably being based on the back of that number, or justified on the back of that number.
Yeah.
Do you ever feel like we're...
For example, you can't compare the number of cases now versus in March.
Right.
Because in March, the only ones who were tested were people who were sick, who went to the hospital. So that was many of them would be positive because they actually had COVID. But the total number might not have been so high because you weren't testing asymptomatic. And now if you're testing a lot of asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic people, then the case numbers are going to go up just because of that.
Right. And yet we see these graphs from March to April to May to June, and we think we're comparing apples to apples, but we're not. Like you said, you can't compare the data back then because we're testing so much more now.
Yeah.
They don't compare. Also, we're going into flu season, and a COVID death, I think quite literally, is considered a COVID death if someone tested positive within 28 days of the COVID test. I honestly think it means if you were shot in the head and you tested positive to COVID for 28 days, I think that data point is not taken out. And so we see deaths rising that could easily be flu deaths or other lockdown deaths or any number of deaths. Maybe you can talk about that number too.
Yeah, so that's very true. I mean, many people are dying from COVID, but there are also people dying with COVID.
Right.
And there was a study in a province in Sweden, Östergötland, where they looked at people who were recorded as having died of COVID-19. And about half of them died in the hospital. So most of those were actually true COVID, and the other half died at home or in a nursing home. And they looked at all this in the second group. And of those, only 15% actually had COVID-19 as the primary cause of death. And then 85% either it was completely unrelated, they just died with COVID, or it might have been they died of something else, but COVID might have been a contributing factor. So there's a lot of people who die with COVID, and that depends on how we define mortality, and that's also different in different countries. So therefore, it's also difficult to compare different countries because the definition of a COVID death varies.
Right. And I know early on here in England that they weren't even testing. It was COVID symptoms. And that's how they would qualify deaths April, May, and June.
Yeah.
So, yeah, again.
That's why excess death is sort of the best metric, the most objective metric, because it really see people who died from COVID, but also from other things due to collateral damage, for example. So compare the mortality right now with the average of, let's say, the last 5 years, and then adjusting for changes in population numbers.
And how do those numbers look? I mean, you mentioned the ones in Sweden and the US earlier. You said the Sweden adjusted made that death toll look smaller, but in America it was larger. So what do you glean from that data, that there was a lot of collateral damage in addition to the COVID damage?
In the US, yes, I believe so. For example, cardiovascular disease. We know that there are people who died at home from cardiovascular disease because they were afraid to go to the hospital. So yes, we know there has been death from the collateral damage. So that's very tragic.
Yeah.
And we don't have all those numbers yet because we don't keep them on a daily basis as we do with the COVID-19, but they are still there. And in Sweden, the number of the excess mortality is just below 2,000, while there are about 6,000 COVID deaths. So that means that some of those COVID deaths might not have been due to COVID. Some of them might have shortened somebody's life by a few weeks or a few months. So that's another explanation for that. And then that the lockdown could also have prevented some other deaths, like from traffic accidents potentially.
We publish a number every day here in the UK, and it's COVID deaths, and that number has gone from like 150 in the past 5 days to, I think the latest is 400 or something. And I think we look at that number, and that's the only metric, doctor, but we're not looking at a few things. First of all, how many of those deaths, last year would have been classified as something else? It's a great question because we weren't testing for COVID last year. That's one. And then how many other deaths are happening because of lockdown, traffic, all the other issues of not getting to hospital, et cetera. So without looking at those numbers together, it's just this fabricated number that can be used to push almost any agenda. And it's frustrating that that gets pushed in front of us. Also, we look at that number and we see the deaths and we think, again, oh, those are my colleagues, my coworkers, my peer group. When in fact, many times it is these elderly people, sometimes, with ailments as well. And I agree, we should definitely try to protect them, but to try to imply that it's happening to everyone, and that's why we need to lock down everyone, it's just hard to believe sometimes. I mean, doctor, do you sometimes feel like we're in some science fiction movie where there's just this, suspension of disbelief, and then we're all going along? Is this hard to watch for you?
Yes, and when it gets too much, then I go on the internet and I start reading the Swedish newspapers.
And what do they say? They talk sense.
There's more sanity there, I think, with how they have dealt with this pandemic. But if you look at what you said before, if you look at the US, they did a survey, and we know that older people in the US are underestimating the risk to them. They think that they have less risk than they actually do have. While younger people, they overestimate the risk. They think they are at much higher risk than they actually are. So there is certainly a disconnect, and this is the failure of the public health message. There's a disconnect that people think that the younger people are more at risk than they are. And partly, I think, it's because you have a media story about some young person who died, because there are a few mortalities. But then this anecdotal evidence sort of trumps then the statistics.
Yeah.
It's not good.
Yeah, we hear, oh, those kids were partying on the beach and look at all the infection rates, but no one pursues it further and said, oh, yeah, but there were no deaths and now we're shutting everyone down. And yet, like you said, anecdotal vilification of these crazy kids. And now everything gets closed down. All the beaches, all the theaters, schools, when it's just a disproportionate response to this virus.
And when we study epidemiology, like risk factors, whether it's for cardiovascular disease or cancer or anything, if we find a twofold difference in risk between two groups, that's a major effect, a major difference in risk. If we find a fivefold or tenfold, that's just amazing in difference in risk. And in COVID, it's not twofold or fivefold or tenfold or even hundredfold. It's more than 1,000-fold difference in the risk between the different groups. So, and influenza also have a different age risk, because it's more risky for the older people. But COVID is even more extreme than influenza.
Right. And this is something you just don't see very often in these diseases. So when you see it, it highlights the fact that we need a completely different way of dealing with each one of these age groups.
Yeah, and this is different from the 1918 flu pandemic, for example, because the 1918 flu pandemic actually affected young people a lot. So a lot of younger people died in that pandemic. So it's very different this time around compared to 1918. And when I first heard about the pandemic in Wuhan, I quickly realized that this was going to be a worldwide pandemic, that this was not going to be able to contain it in China. It was going to spread. And when it direct to other country, it will be impossible to contain it. But I was only worried for about 10 minutes, because I looked at the data from Wuhan by age. And I quickly realized that my children, I have 3 children, and as a parent, I care more about my children than myself. So I quickly realized that this is not dangerous to them. And then I was sort of more calm and no longer worried, because those are the 3 most important people in my life. So,
yeah. You know, we've seen comparisons made to the Hong Kong flu. And I think in 1968, 80,000 people died here in Britain, which is, 30,000 more that have currently classified as died from COVID. And yet the country didn't really react in any way that compares to what we're doing now. Obviously, no lockdown, there was no vaccine or even a search for one. We just kind of business, everyone moved on and obviously found a way to live through it. Do you ever look at those two comparisons between then and now, where now it seems like everyone expects the government to do this, the government is being super proactive? What do you see when you look at those two?
Yeah, another example is the famous Woodstock Festival in the late 60s, which actually happened during a pandemic. So that's another example of how we dealt with it differently then than now. And I think I prefer the Woodstock Festival to our current approach. I think this idea that we can somehow have zero COVID is completely misguided. But worse than that, is very dangerous, because in an attempt to have zero death from COVID, we're actually increasing the mortality.
Right. And so people that understand zero COVID is this fantasy of eliminating the virus. And if you go down that route, what you'll do is you'll eliminate everything else, right? The economy, the mental health, everything. In that pursuit of this kind of utopic dream, you end up actually killing everything else.
Yes.
Yeah. It's something that really begs analysis, and really wondering what we're going to do. What do you think, Doctor, is the way forward? Like, are the governments going to realize at some point we got to start looking at different metrics? The next 6 months, we're obviously going through flu season, or this time where we know almost by definition there's going to be more classifications, more deaths. The NHS, by the way, here in the UK is always overwhelmed in December and January. It always is, because it's flu season, it's drinking season, which means the A&E and emergency rooms are constantly full. And so this year they're going to tell the population that we are over capacity, but it's true every year. How are we going to get through this and even get through this winter and then into the spring?
So two things. One is if and when we get a vaccine, and if it's good and safe, then that will help with focus protection. So that will be sort of one additional tool in our toolbox. So I think that could help moving it strategy towards focus protection. But there are still question marks about that, of course. And even if we had a vaccine now, it will take many, many months to vaccinate the large millions and millions of people. So that is going to take the time, and it might not be so helpful for this second wave in the Northern Hemisphere. The other thing is, I think that what eventually will change it is coming from below, from the population. I mean, there are protests against lockdowns throughout Europe. So I have more trust in the population to change this compared to the politicians or the media to make a turnaround. They have already sort of invested their prestige in what they're doing, and it's maybe hard for them to take a different tack, psychologically. But again, I'm not an expert at all on politics, so you probably understand those things much better than I do.
Well, doctor, you don't have to be an expert in politics to know that something's not right with the decisions that are being made. And again, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but to see the government, the mainstream media, and our technology platforms suppress science, to suppress logic, to suppress all of the work you've done for the past 10 or 20 years and create their own narrative and policies, I mean, it's hard to watch. And, it's definitely bias. I mean, you know that. You've felt it now. And that's concerning, isn't it?
It is concerning. And I'm also concerned about the future of science because when this pandemic is over, the answer will be there. It will be clear to most people. So there will be increasing, and I think there already has been an increasing distrust in science and the scientific community. And that's going to have effect on other things as well. For example, if we have people, scientists, who are promoting these lockdown things, which does not make scientific sense, but then they also promote vaccines. And I'm a big believer of vaccines. I think it's one of the greatest inventions of mankind, having saved enormous amount of lives. But if the same person are promoting lockdowns and vaccines, why would people trust them when they then promote vaccines?
Yeah.
So there's a concern, and when the scientific community has sort of failed with the response to the pandemic, and then the scientific community says, go vaccinate, why? There's already distrust there. So that's going to make it more difficult to, suppose we get a really good vaccine that's both efficacy and safe. We don't know that yet, but suppose we do that. This mistrust in science is going to make it more difficult to convince people that this vaccination is a good thing.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And we're seeing that being done by governments, by the mainstream media, and by our tech platforms, where they'll go after and pick and choose the scientists that don't support their agenda, which is sometimes short-term agenda. They'll go vilify them. Again, sometimes actually taint the study itself by the false signatures. They'll go after their characters. And then, again, like you said, how is the public to trust science? I mean, science is supposed to be agnostic, right? It's supposed to be personality independent. It's supposed to be all about the numbers. I mean, I studied mechanical engineering at MIT. And when you showed me the test results, I didn't ask, show me the background of the person that created the test. I look at the numbers. And so it's frustrating. And I agree, science will take a hit on the back of this.
And scientific disagreements is actually a part of science, and it's actually a good thing because you should have that discourse.
Yeah.
And it's okay for scientists to have different views. And actually, one thing that's good with Sweden is that there have been critics of the Swedish approach within Sweden. Of course, there's been an enormous onslaught of criticism internationally on Swedish approach, but also among some academics within Sweden, the infectious disease epidemiologists have, with one exception, been very much in favor of the general approach. But among some other academics, they have been critical, but they have actually voiced their concerns very clearly in the major daily newspapers going against the government. And I think I don't agree with their criticism, but I think it's very good that it was published and open. Because then those of us who disagree can sort of write something and explain why we don't agree with them. And with something like so important as the pandemic, which affects everybody, having everybody, the public being able to actually see these scientists and discuss this, I think is actually critically important.
Yeah.
But in the US, that has not happened. And many of the lockdown proponents have been they have not wanted to debate those of us who believe in focused protection. There has been a few exceptions, but in general, they have stayed away from wanting to do that.
Yeah, and we see this kind of on from leftist politicians and a lot of times technology platforms that they don't want to debate. They kind of want to cancel people. So they want to just disintegrate them as opposed to have that conversation. And that's the problem with censorship, is that you can't get an open, honest debate, which means the best idea doesn't win. And any scientist knows that, how you solve bad data is more data. You don't try to not talk about it. You try to, like you said, have that debate so we can find out what the best idea wins. But our government has been protecting us, same with our platforms, from seeing these dangerous ideas. And it just squashes that debate. Doctor, before we go, I want to get your thoughts about vaccines. I know you've spent a long time researching those. You've done some work with the CDC. I've had a lot of guests on my show that have talked about all the details about vaccines, which I never understood. I didn't know about, the Act of 1986, and I didn't know about a lot of histories and stories and facts. But also, we've got this news lately that Pfizer has the miracle vaccine. And I'm curious on what you think of that. And also, what does it mean from a practical standpoint? I always watch that movie Contagion. Have you seen the movie Contagion?
Yes, I have, yeah.
And so I watched it back in March, by the way, when this all happened. And it was very sobering to watch Gwyneth Paltrow die on the kitchen floor. But one of the things that was embedded in that movie, Doctor, is that at the end of it, and I heard it was pretty accurate with everything that it portrayed, but at the end, everyone gets the nasal vaccine and they're 100% cured and everything's okay. And it was a part of the narrative that just didn't seem very scientific, as in, like you said, what is the efficacy? Who can have it? How do we roll it out? Do we need to test it? So I want to get your thoughts on this latest Pfizer piece. They said they've had some great statistical results, but I don't think it's been peer reviewed. And I just want to know, what is the dangers and then what are the positives of this?
So first, generally, there are some vaccines that are very, very good, have very high efficacy, like, for example, the measles vaccine. There are other vaccines that are not as good, like the flu vaccine. Some years it's better and some years it's worse, but it might only have like a 50% efficacy, for example. It's still very useful and a good public health measure. But so different vaccines work. Some work really well and some work less well. So the question, we don't know yet about the COVID-19 vaccines. If the Pfizer vaccine is a miracle vaccine, wonderful, great. But I've only seen the press release, which is the only results that are public. They also have public the protocol for the study, but so we don't really know how good it is. From the press release, it says that it was 90% efficacy on infection. if that also carries over to mortality, that's very, very good. But I don't think they have those results yet, because in a trial you have many infections. You can have the statistical power to actually evaluate that. You have fewer hospitalizations and you have even fewer mortality. So it takes a longer time to actually evaluate the mortality outcome, which is, of course, the most important outcome. So if it is a miracle vaccine, fantastic, great. But from the press release, we don't know that yet.
All right. It sounds like you are still skeptical.
Well, I'm neither sort of skeptical or optimistic, because I want to see the data before I make an opinion on it.
Right.
So, and that's, I think, the only way that the scientists can operate on these things.
Okay, so we need to know more data. This data also hasn't been peer reviewed. Does it need to be peer reviewed as well?
Well, the key thing in the US, it will be approved. The FDA will decide if they're going to approve the vaccine or not.
Okay.
So that's a decision that the FDA will do based on the data that's presented to FDA.
Okay.
And presumably around the same time, they will also publish the results to the public, Pfizer. But then after that, every time a vaccine or drug is approved, we still have questions about it. So
such as?
that I'm working on as a scientist is the CDC has something called the Vaccine Safety Data Link, where we are monitoring new vaccines on a weekly basis. So every week we get new data: who got the vaccine, are there any adverse reactions to this vaccine? And we do that to quickly detect problems if there are problems. For most vaccines, they are safe and there are no problems, but we still want to monitor it to find them quickly if there is a problem. So as soon as the vaccine is approved by FDA and then it's being used, then these surveillance system, monitoring system for vaccine safety will sort of kick in to find out whether there are any more rare adverse reactions that was not clear from the approval process.
Okay. You said the FDA will make the decision. Are you concerned that a government body like that will be making a decision to, inject potentially billions of people with a vaccine, and that same government has been making incorrect decisions about lockdown based on flawed data or the wrong data? Do you worry that a government like that will also rush this through for its own agendas and policies?
So there are different bodies who actually are responsible for these things. So in terms of the public health response in the US, is sort of the CDC, who are mainly responsible for public health, together with like the task force that they put together, while it's FDA who is responsible for approving the vaccine. Yes, that they are with drugs. There's obviously a desire to have this out as soon as possible because it's an emergency. It will be an emergency authorization. But
does that concern you as a scientist?
Then to try to get it out there as soon as possible, as soon as there's evidence that it works.
In the past, it's taken 10 years, 15, 20 years to develop vaccines. Yeah. We developed one in a matter of months, and we're about to put it in all of our human bodies because we need to rush it in to stop a pandemic, which is or is not happening. Does that concern you at all? That we haven't tested this? We don't know if it's safe for our elder people or our younger children or even normal adults. Does that worry you?
So I think Pfizer have had tens of thousands of people who have received the vaccine. So we do have tests for that. And they will have been monitored very closely for adverse reactions. I don't know exactly what age group they are, but I assume it's mostly older adults.
What about long-term effects?
Those we won't know until long-term. Those have not been monitored before approval of the vaccine. People look at adverse reactions a few months, but we don't know anything about effects 1 year or 2 years or 3 years from now. So that's sort of a big question mark.
If you look at the history of the world, if we were to go ahead and vaccinate a couple billion people on this planet, It's probably the single biggest decision we'll make on the future of humanity in one fell swoop, with something we know a little bit about, we don't know that much about, but there's never been a single thing, including a nuclear bomb or a genocide, that comes anywhere near the fact that it could alter the society forever.
So I think that both for logistical reasons, it will be, not everybody will be vaccinated immediately. So presumably the healthcare workers and nursing home staff should be sort of at the top priority of vaccinations. So, and then we will monitor them for safety of the vaccine in them. And that should be monitored very closely. And at least in the United States, it will be monitored very closely. Any adverse reactions that occur. But of course, what happens 2 years down the road, we don't know. On the other hand, if we look at the history of vaccines, when there has been problems with vaccine, it has usually been most commonly within a couple of weeks, but sometimes within a few months. But so historically in vaccines, these long-term adverse reactions are not very common, so or almost non-existent.
There's definitely some people that would disagree with you, like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., but we'll get into that on another day, Doctor.
Yeah, he has different views on vaccines than I do, yes.
He definitely does. But I appreciate both of your views. I really do. And that's why we have this platform. So both of you can speak freely and people can get all the information and make decisions themselves. Again, I don't think anyone should ever listen to any one person for their decisions. I think they should listen to as many people as possible, do their own research, and make their decisions. Doctor.
And the key thing now is right now we don't know the quality of these vaccines. So nobody should right now decide, yes, I'm going to take it, or no, I'm not going to take it. We first need to know the data from these vaccines before anybody should decide. And it could very well be that for this group, it's really a good idea to have the vaccine. For these other groups, it's not a good idea to have it. That could very well be the case, but we don't know yet.
Yeah, and we don't know what's going to happen, like you said, with older people in these vaccines or younger people in these vaccines. Like, I guess we just don't know. So we'll have to see. It's been interesting to process this news. The timeliness of the news was very interesting, how it was announced after the election. But again, I won't get into other strange theories around that, Doctor. Doctor, I really appreciate all the time today. Some incredible information. Any final thoughts or anything we missed when it comes to things that our viewers should know about what's happening right now?
I think the key message is we have to do a better job protecting the elderly, the old people, the high risk. Young people should live their lives as normally as they can. They should always wash their hands and stay home if you're sick, and those things, sort of general precautions. Also, we know that cardiovascular disease and obesity, we know that obesity and diabetes increases risk. So if you ever want to live a more healthy life with exercising and eating healthy, this is a good time to do that. And there's no negative consequences of that, those type of changes. So.
Yeah. One of the most frustrating things for me is that not one word has been mentioned in the past 6 months about investing in people's health. We just haven't seen it, Doctor. We haven't seen anyone trying to look after obesity or improve your cardiovascular or also cessation of smoking or drinking. But we'll talk about masks and distancing and all these other measures, but there's been not one mention of investing in people's health. Matter of fact, pubs opened before gyms opened here. And that's been a little frustrating that hasn't been pushed.
Yeah, and kids should be out in the playground, so playing soccer or cricket or rugby, etc. That is, or in my case, I will always encourage my son to go play basketball with his friends because he needs it both for the social aspects and for physical activities. So those are important things and we shouldn't prevent people from doing those things.
Yeah, very much so. Well, I appreciate your ideas of this focused protection, again, outlined in the Great Barrington Declaration, which anyone can go hopefully find on Google or maybe an actual search engine and learn more about. Again, this is something that we've been talking about for the past few months here. London right now is completely locked down. The city's losing £2 billion. The country is every single day. And it's all about getting the right people back to work, protecting the vulnerable, making a proportionate response to the virus, and putting science first. You know, the science seems to go right out the window. And again, governments are making decisions based on flawed policies, and it's just frustrating. And the people in the streets that I meet, Doctor, they are very frustrated. They're watching their businesses go under. They're watching their own mental health deteriorate, their physical health. The younger generation here, they're calling them Generation COVID. You know, their hopes of the future are dashed. You know, my own daughter's 16. She's not able to take her examinations. She's asking me questions like, am I ever going to be able to get a job? Am I ever going to go to university? And it seems like we're doing all of this in a disproportionate way to try to protect a few people by trying to protect everyone. And we're actually doing disservices to both populations.
Exactly.
Yeah. And again, the care homes here in the UK have been a mess. And it's still not clear that their policies are very intelligent. And yet we're being talked about this moonshot where they test everybody in the country for 40 billion pounds. Whereas just from a simple discussion with you, we know that that's not going to help. It's going to give us the wrong data, and you're not protecting those vulnerable. So again, I'm a man of science. I think humanity's best decisions have been based in science. If we look back to Copernicus, to Einstein, it's the numbers that always taught us the way to go forward. So I hope people can really listen to this and digest it and really push their governments to move forward. And you might be right, Doctor. We might need the people on the streets ultimately to say, no, we're not having it. Here, we're locked down in London, but a lot of people, they don't take it seriously anymore because they don't believe the government knows what they're doing. They don't see the evidence themselves, and they just feel that it's flawed. And I think as this goes on further, it'll make it harder to enact real science in the future unless we get back to these basics. So again, thank you for the time. Hopefully we will figure this out in the future. The best way we can do it is keep talking about the ideas. And again, we'll put some links below directly to the Great Barrington Declaration so people can watch it. And Doctor, I just want to thank you for putting yourself out there and going against the grain. I've had on this platform doctors, nurses, scientists, Nobel Prize winners who all said the opposite of what mainstream media and government said, and they all were censored, persecuted, vilified, and yet now a lot of their ideas are coming true. And we will do a forensic analysis of this in 5 years, and like you said, it will show exactly what happened, and we'll know what the real and the right decisions were, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I think so too. All right, Doctor, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Next time, let's do this in person, either in Boston or in London. And I appreciate your ideas. Please keep fighting for the truth and keep moving forward.
Thank you so much. Great pleasure talking to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Doctor. And thanks to everybody here. We appreciate you on the Digital Freedom Platform. Again, share this link via the sidebar to anyone out there. We're going to keep putting these ideas forward. I appreciate your time, Doctor, and I appreciate everybody here. We'll see you next time on the Digital Freedom Platform. Take care.